One of the key results from Dynamic Coast 2 is that coastal erosion is affecting more and more of our coasts over and above historical extents and rates. And both of those statistics are expected to increase into the future. So more coastline will be eroded and at a quicker rate, particularly if global greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise and that forces sea level to rise also. For example, the inset shows the percentage of transects eroding in 2020 is around 40% of all transects. By 2050, that increases to 70% of all transects under a high emission scenario and perhaps around 60% for a low emissions scenario. The mean eroded distance, however, increases by 2050 to about 10 metres or thereabouts. But under a high emissions scenario by 2100, we can expect of the order of 50 metres of erosion on some transects around our soft coast. That represents a substantial increase. Such coastal erosion is expected to significantly alter the coastline, but it will also impact upon society's assets at the coast. Remember that we have anticipated a precautionary baseline using a high emissions scenario and a do-nothing coastal management strategy. Under both of those assumptions, we anticipate that around £1.2 billion of coastal assets will be at risk from erosion by 2050. That's assuming that no defences are maintained, a do-nothing coastal management strategy. However, even if defences are maintained, we still have of the order of £800 million worth of assets remaining at risk by 2050. Another key result represents an updated analysis since the 2017 Dynamic Coast 1 data, where we have more accurate property data and, of course, more extensive areas of coast being subsumed into an erosion. And what we find is that natural defences now are protecting 14.5 billion of assets into the future. Artificial defences protect 5 billion assets into the future. So our natural coasts are doing a great job in terms of protecting our assets. So it follows that we need to monitor, value and conserve all of our shoreline, not just the protected section using artificial structures, but also the natural defended section to keep track of the changing risk to assets. We need to use our natural shorelines much more effectively than we have in the past. Climate change and its associated sea level rise is certainly making erosion and flooding more likely. Erosion is set to increase in extent and rate in the future, but so too is coastal flooding, because in areas of low-lying land, flooding envelopes will increase markedly if the protective mechanisms are removed by coastal erosion. So if beaches or dunes are protecting an area of low-lying land and those beaches and dunes are eroded into the future, then the flood envelope increases substantially. Dynamic Coast has mapped those areas, and our evidence will greatly enhance our ability to act and adapt in time to begin to preempt any increase in flood envelopes into the future. Effectively, new research will inform better coastal management and help avoid the severing and flooding of trunk roads, etc., into the future. A key result emanating from our assessment of coastal assets adjacent to the shore is that the coastal erosion risk clusters within a few local authority areas. The slide shows the risk to road networks on a decadal basis up to 2050 and beyond to 2100. And the left-hand slide shows you the national picture of lengths of roads affected by erosion, using, of course, the precautionary baseline we talked about earlier. That shows that by 2050, we might expect about 50 to 60 kilometres of road to be anticipated to be affected by erosion. By 2100, 175 kilometres of road. But when the data is segregated down into local authority areas, it's clear that 4 local authorities have higher risks than others. These authorities are Argyll and Bute, Dumfries and Galloway, Highland and Orkney. All of those areas have substantial road networks running along the coast that may be anticipated to be at risk of erosion, at least by 2050 and forward to 2100. So Dynamic Coast allows that sort of analysis to take place depending on which asset is looked at. It could be buildings, it could be rail networks, it could be water infrastructure. The same analysis is possible using the datasets within Dynamic Coast 2. One of the exploratory areas that Dynamic Coast 2 investigated was the extent to which social vulnerability overmapped into areas of coastal erosion. In other words, can we identify a coastal erosion disadvantage on various areas of society? So by mapping social vulnerability in coastal areas based upon census data and other data against coastal erosion risk based on Dynamic Coast 2 results, we can identify coastal erosion disadvantage, effectively a heat map of where coastal erosion may impact differentially upon various members and various areas of society. And that allows inclusion of social justice and climate justice aspects into any forward planning that might take place with respect to climate change. In addition to producing a national picture on coastal erosion, we've also produced detailed local assessments to inform more complex changes. And we've done this in conjunction with local officials in local authorities and also with national agencies. And some of those changes threaten some of Scotland's key assets, including some treasured coastal sites. For example, looking at Montrose Bay, our transects, which are produced every 10 metres along the coast, have identified several flood corridors, potential flood corridors through the dunes, where those dunes are exceptionally narrow. So narrow, in fact, that some of the altitudes may be exceeded within about 4 or 5 years to allow floodwaters to enter the area behind the beach. That's of hugely important information to allow local planners to begin to formulate plans to cope with anticipated erosion corridors. Similarly, at the Blea of Scale in Orkney, where we have a UNESCO World Heritage Site, Dynamic Coast 2's local assessments have identified the rates of erosion to identify decadal positions of the shoreline as it moves landwards over the years, effectively identifying that flooding is not a major issue in Skara Brae. Coastal erosion is the issue which threatens the World Heritage Site into the future. One of the more interesting results is that natural defences are serving Scotland exceptionally well in terms of protection of assets, but they do need to be valued, maintained and enhanced with extra natural sediment to help nature to help us. Adding sediment to beaches targets the key weak points and allows the natural protection to become more resilient. For example, St Andrews has had decades of good experience of targeted dune and marsh enhancements. Dune raising on the Eden estuary has been exceptionally successful, and so has marsh planting, planting of salt marsh grasses to help absorb wave energy. In so doing, we reduce the need for hard structural coastal defences and effectively buy time to allow us to begin to formulate more sustainable long-term measures to protect and enhance coastal resilience. Perhaps our key results from Dynamic Coast 2 is that regardless of greenhouse gas emission cuts, we all are already on track for future sea level rise and coastal change. The problem is that greenhouse gas reduction lags well behind anticipated coastal impacts. The coastal impacts are with us now. So in order to avoid serious impacts into the future, prompt action is required now. Some of this action will be focused upon adaptation, and that adaptation is key to allow space. key to allow space both for a future shoreline that's repositioned more landwards than it is just now, and space for assets that are displaced from that coastal area inland. Accommodation space needs to be built into our planning regimes now to allow for these two aspects of shore displacement. Sea level rise is going to impact upon us well before greenhouse gas emissions begin to level off and reduce. The time for action, arguably, is now. Throughout the dynamic coast research, it's been clear that to date our coastal management approaches have been very slow to change. We've effectively gone along a fairly familiar pattern of resisting erosion by working against nature and relying on artificially maintained seawalls and revetments to stop and control increased erosion and flooding. What Dynamic Coast has provided is an improved evidence base, and that evidence base can be used as an opportunity to begin to better manage our coastal zone. And that might be through ways in which we might accommodate erosion. The inset shows a spectrum from resisting erosion at the top to accommodating erosion at the bottom. Resisting erosion basically relies upon artificially maintaining resilience against erosion and flooding by extending seawalls, by increasing the heights of seawalls, and so on. That leads to a never-ending cycle whereby the seawall requires to be extended again and again, and the seawall height requires to be extended ad infinitum into a future where sea level rise is virtually inevitable. Alternatively, to accommodate erosion, working with nature is a viable alternative. We can raise sand dunes. We can allow our beaches to accept more sediment delivered artificially to help resist erosion. We can also begin to think about our coastal land use and relocate our assets further landwards. We can prepare to adapt. We can prepare to adapt by repositioning our coastline and repositioning those assets into the future. It's certainly the case that resisting erosion is going to be essential for key assets such as ports and harbours. That's almost a given. But elsewhere, we've got choices as to whether it's more cost effective to resist erosion by structures or accommodate erosion by working with nature and allowing the coast to relocate into a more equilibrium position that might be further landwards. The Dynamic Coast experience provides an evidence base to become sea level wise. It allows us to better manage our coastal zone, perhaps through these dynamic adaptive pathways to flexibly respond and adapt to a future climate. There are key issues here about what thresholds are required for us to enact any particular strategy. But the key point here is that we need to adapt to buy time to allow us to begin to put in place more sustainable strategies for the future.